All right, we're live. Today, I'm going to discuss the Trevor Bauer situation. I'm going to give the backstory. I'm going to explain about. I'm going to talk about the temporary restraining order process here in California, and then I'm going to talk about the goals of both sides, the petitioner, the respondent, as well as what happened today. One second, let me just turn this off. All right. So the background is this, from my understanding. For those of you who don't know, Trevor Bauer is the reigning Cy Young Award winner and a pitcher for the LA Dodgers. He's one of the best pitchers in baseball right now. I believe he signed a contract for upwards of $20 million a year, approximately. And back in the spring, a young lady sent him a message through IG. They spoke a few days on IG, and then from there, they ended up having 2 sexual encounters, which are the only 2 times it appears that they met in person, and that's the basis for this temporary restraining order. In California, the temporary restraining order hearings are held in like quasi family court / civil court. There's no jury. It's all decided by the judge. What happens is that you file your claims, and then depending on the facts that you allege and your paperwork, if you allege real facts, from my experience, most courts will grant the temporary restraining order, which means that you'll get a restraining order until the conclusion of the restraining order hearing, which is what occurred in this case. She submitted her facts and all of her documents, and it sounds like she had 60 pages of evidence, which is, from my experience, filing restraining orders and defending some, that's a lot. Because the garden variety restraining order just is basically the number of pages on the forms that the court provides you. And so it's not surprising that, given the nature of the allegations, that her temporary restraining order was granted. After it was granted, Trevor Bauer's attorneys, I think they've made 2 requests for continuances, and that puts us here to today. Now, she alleges that essentially that she was sexually assaulted, that while she agreed to have sex with Mr. Bauer, she did not agree to all the activities and physical contact that took place. Mr. Bauer's position is that it was all consensual, totally, from the beginning to the end, and that includes all the contact, all the sexual contact. And so, in temporary restraining order hearings, we don't have plaintiffs, we don't have defendants, we have petitioners and respondent. So the alleged victim is the petitioner, and Mr. Bauer is the respondent. Now, what's interesting here is that currently the Pasadena Police Department are still investigating this matter, and they haven't presented their investigation to the LA County District Attorney's Office. And so it's unclear whether or not there's going to be any charges that are filed. But that's kind of like the elephant in the room, because practically speaking, the worst case scenario that happens when you lose a temporary restraining order hearing is you have to stay away from the petitioner, which in this case, Mr. Bauer hadn't made any contact with her for 6 weeks between a couple of days after the incident and then when the restraining order paperwork was filed. At 4 to 6 weeks were between that time period. And so it didn't appear that he was actively contacting her. And the other thing is that if you do own firearms, licensed firearms, you have to give all those licensed firearms up during the course and scope, during the course of the restraining order. And so a restraining order can last up to 5 years, but depending on the circumstances, from my experience, usually the restraining orders that I've got granted recently have lasted a year or two. And so, but the goals for both sides are to get the evidence out in the open, and so that for Mr. Bauer is to get the evidence, cross-examine the victim, impeach her so that she's not credible, do the same to all of her witnesses so that the district attorney who's going to review the case doesn't feel like there's enough evidence of a crime and Mr. Bauer doesn't face any charges. For the petitioner and the alleged victim, her and her attorney's goals are to put this out in the public, make it as public as possible. Hopefully when Mr. Bauer testifies, they win either way. He's either going to testify and assert his Fifth Amendment right, which is the right to remain silent, or he's going to get into the details as to what happened, and they'll have an opportunity to cross-examine him. Either way, from my perspective, is a win-win for them. But ultimately, I think that the goal of this accuser is to get justice, because I believe she went to the cops initially and they haven't really done anything. And by having this public hearing on the facts is going to create more pressure for the DA to file charges against Mr. Bauer. Now, Mr. Bauer's attorneys are arguing. So let me back up. So that's the goals of both sides. The petitioner is alleging and arguing that that there was physical contact beyond sex, which resulted in her having substantial scratches on her back, scratches on her face, bruises to both eyes. She alleged today in her testimony that Mr. Bauer punched her in her private parts, punched her throughout her body, and she believes that she didn't consent to that. She didn't consent to being choked out, and she was choked out at least on one occasion, it appears, where she lost consciousness, and that she didn't consent to that. Where Mr. Bauer's attorneys argue that this was completely consensual and that there's no need for the temporary restraint or for the restraining order because Mr. Bauer had stopped contacting her. And given the context of their situation or relationship where they had only met 2 times, to go 6 weeks without contacting her, they're going to argue that the restraining order is not needed, that Mr. Bauer doesn't pose a threat to her any longer. Now, ultimately, the court is in a way going to decide if there was physical assault. And the only way, in my opinion, that you can find assault, given the facts, is if you believe that the rough sex, quote unquote, wasn't consensual. And so that's really at issue here. And depending on how the facts come out, Mr. Bauer may be in trouble and may be facing some criminal liability, because according to the reporters that were inside the courtroom today, they believed that the alleged victim came off credible. Now, today she was only questioned by her own attorneys during direct examination, and her testimony was going 4 hours. right? Keep in mind that a lot of these celebrity cases aren't like real cases. I've had probably 10 restraining order hearings approximately over my 16-year career. And I've sat in on even more than that, probably triple, 4 times as many as that, as I've waited for my cases to get called. And typically a restraining order hearing lasts an hour or two, maybe. Maybe. But celebrities it's like a whole nother court system. So for a judge to allow the victim to speak 4 hours tells you the seriousness that everyone's taking these allegations, because that's an incredible amount of time. Incredible. But today she apparently appears to be credible, but tomorrow's going to be the big day, because tomorrow Mr. Bauer's attorney is going to have an opportunity to cross-examine her. And what I haven't discussed is that she's made, there's evidence of her messaging with Mr. Bauer through text messages and Instagram direct messages, as well as text messages to her relatives, and I believe like a best friend, where that suggests that the encounter was consensual and that this is simply a money play. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens tomorrow, how she holds up. Now, her attorney, and I speak about this all the time, is as attorneys, we got to get in front of the bad facts. And so a lot came out today. It came out that she's struggled with alcoholism since she was 16, and that she's been sober for 1.5 years. And at first when I read that, I was like, oh, she's being cross-examined already. But no, her attorney is just getting out in front of that. So anything that's remotely bad, they're addressing it. She's addressing the text messages, according to observers. And so her attorneys on direct examination are giving her an opportunity to put positive spin on what happened before she's cross-examined. Because the worst thing you want to do is, as an attorney, is to put your head in the ground and hope and pray that the other side is not going to bring it up, and then they bring it up to the judge for the first time. And it's the cross-examinations typically done with leading questions. And so leading questions typically call for yes, no, very short answers. And so she's not going to be given an opportunity to give more context. And so it's important that they were able to discuss that today. And so I'm just really interested in what happens, because unlike the Deshaun Watson's case, which I've covered, even though she mentions in the messages that she's going to get a lot of money for this, she did go to the cops, and she didn't initiate any settlement negotiations or NDAs directly with Mr. Bauer before filing their restraining order, which from my impression in the general public, that seems to go over better. But at the same time, the messages that, at least that I've seen, it appears that it may have been consensual, at least part of the quote unquote rev sex. And so in my opinion, what's going to happen is it depends on how this hearing, how this judicial officer, this judge determines what ref sex is, or what can be, and if the victim is credible. Because if the judge doesn't hear from Mr. Bauer, there's going to be a strong likelihood that the restraining order is going to be granted. And from my experience in these situations where you have a domestic situation, typically in an abundance of caution, I find that if it's close, the petitioner is going to get the restraining order. Now, they may not get it for 5 years. They may only get it for a year and tell you to come back in a year if there's any issues. But if it's close and a tie goes to the runner, to use a baseball analogy, it's going to go to the petitioner and the restraining order is going to be granted. Now, with the district attorney, it's going to be tough. And that's why I think that if Mr. Bauer's attorneys are able to do a good job discrediting the victim's credibility on cross-examination, that may stop the district attorney from filing any charges if she doesn't appear to be credible. But it just kind of depends. It's interesting. I mean, this case is really interesting. I'm also interested in see what the Dodgers are going to do. Are the Dodgers going to continue to put him on personal leave, or are they going to allow him to come back? Because technically he hasn't even been charged with a crime. And so I'm completely interested. He's one of the best pitchers in the game. The Dodgers appear to be going to playoffs. And so I can see in terms of the optics how it's a bad look for Mr. Bauer to be pitching in the playoffs or in the World Series when baseball is going to be in the public eye at the highest point. And that's going to need to be discussed if he's on the field playing for the Dodgers. So I can see why baseball may want to either suspend him or put him off on leave. Because my understanding now that this evidence is coming into the public eye, they'll be able to take a look at the testimony of all the witnesses, and that could be the basis of the suspension. At the same time, he hasn't, optics be damned, he hasn't even been charged with a crime. And even if he's charged with the crime, that doesn't mean he's entitled to the presumption of innocence. And this case is definitely not straightforward. It's very nuanced. And there's evidence, there's objective evidence to point to both sides, and ultimately kind of comes down to what he said, she said. It's clear that they had sex. No one disputes that. It's clear that there's some bruises, although Mr. Bauer's attorneys today are, at least with the news reports that I read, that they're raising, they believe that her photos may have been doctored. But even if the photos have been doctored, there's probably descriptions of her injuries in the emergency room documents. So I'm assuming that based upon the photos that I've seen, that even if the photos have been enhanced a bit, that there's some basis to those bruises and those scratches, and then that would be documented in the medical records. So, but it all comes down to whether or not the conduct was consensual. And yeah, I don't really have an opinion. I don't have an opinion at this point. I haven't seen all the evidence, but I think that it's it's tough because now I'm not the biggest baseball fan, but what I've read about Mr. Bauer is that he's not that well liked. This is his first year in the city or in LA. And I don't know how he's going to come across. I don't know if he's beloved down there. But generally speaking, when you look at most celebrity trials, a lot of times the celebrities are acquitted of these type of charges, or they're not charged. They get the benefit of the doubt when non-celebrities may not get that same benefit. So I'm fascinated by this case. I'm going to be trying to make videos. Hopefully I'll make a video on day 2 if I have time, discuss the cross-examination, because again, the cross-examination is going to be the show. We'll see how well the victim holds up. And I think that's all I have. So I don't want to get to rambling. If you like this content, please like and subscribe. Please share your thoughts from your impression of the text messages and the photos. Do you think that it was consensual? And or do you think that what she described today and what are in the photographs and the text messages go beyond consensual sex? Please like and subscribe. Please let me know what videos you would like me to make. If you got this far in the video, I want to thank you. Salute to you. Salute to the 2 people who came into the chat today. That's 2 more people than I had in my last live. We're out here building. Thank you so much. Salute.